My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm about to tell you how a single comment at a family barbecue led to the most satisfying career moment of my life. Picture this: your brother-in-law, smirking over his beer, dismissing your six-figure cybersecurity consulting career as entry-level work, while your entire family nods along like he's some kind of business guru. Fast forward 18 months, and I'm sitting in a glass-walled conference room as the newly appointed VP of Digital Security, watching that same brother-in-law's face drain of color as HR explains his termination. But this story isn't just about workplace revenge, though that part was pretty sweet. It's about what happens when someone underestimates you so completely that they hand you the perfect opportunity to prove them wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, I was running late for my sister's birthday barbecue, juggling my laptop bag and a gift wrapped in silver paper as I rushed through the parking lot of my downtown Austin apartment complex. My phone buzzed with another client alert about a potential security breach at a major retail chain, and I found myself mentally calculating response times while trying to remember if I'd grabbed the right wine from my kitchen counter. This was my life at 32, a constant balancing act between family obligations and a cybersecurity consulting career that most of my relatives still couldn't quite explain to their friends. I'd been building TechFlow solutions for 3 years now, starting as a solo consultant and gradually expanding into a team of 12 specialists who handled everything from penetration testing to incident response for Fortune 500 companies. The work was intense, the hours unpredictable, and the pay better than anything I'd imagined possible when I was the first Martinez to graduate college with a computer science degree. But try explaining the intricacies of network security architecture to my tia Rosa, who still asked me to fix her email password every time we gathered for Sunday dinner. The drive to Becca's house in the suburbs gave me 20 minutes to decompress and shift gears from crisis management mode to family time. My sister Rebecca had married David Thompson 2 years ago, and their home in Cedar Park represented everything my parents had dreamed of for their daughters. White picket fence, manicured lawn, a 2-car garage, and enough space for the grandchildren they kept hinting about during every family gathering. It was beautiful, really, but every time I pulled into their driveway, I felt like I was crossing into a different universe where success was measured in square footage and neighborhood prestige, rather than the complex problems I solved for multinational corporations. Becca greeted me at the front door with her usual enthusiasm, her dark hair pulled back in a perfectly casual updo that probably took 30 minutes to achieve. She wore a flowing sundress that complemented her newly bronzed skin, and I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly she'd transformed from the scrappy kid who used to help me with algebra homework into this polished suburban hostess. "Jess, finally, I was starting to worry you'd gotten caught up in some computer emergency again," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive vanilla perfume and hair products I couldn't pronounce. "David's been talking about wanting to hear more about your work. He's really curious about the tech industry." Something in her tone made me pause, but I pushed the feeling aside and followed her through the house toward the back patio, where I could already hear the familiar sounds of family conversation mixing with the sizzle of meat on the grill. My parents were there, of course, my mom fussing over side dishes while my dad held court near the barbecue pit, gesturing animatedly as he told some story I'd probably heard a dozen times before. A few of David's colleagues from Thompson and Associates were scattered around the patio furniture, drinks in hand, looking like they'd stepped out of a business magazine's lifestyle section. David himself stood at the center of the group, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. At 35, he had the kind of confident bearing that came from years of closing deals and commanding boardrooms. His sandy hair was perfectly styled, and his smile had that practiced quality of someone who'd learned to charm clients and colleagues with equal ease. When he saw me approaching, he raised his beer in a mock salute. "Here she is, the family tech genius," he announced, and I felt every eye on the patio turn toward me. "Jessica's got some kind of computer consulting business downtown. Very impressive stuff." I forced a smile and accepted the beer Becca pressed into my hand. "Thanks, David. Happy birthday, by the way. 34 looks good on you." 35, Becca corrected with a laugh, "but who's counting?" Come on, let me introduce you to everyone. These are some of David's partners from the firm. The next hour passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful navigation of family dynamics. David's colleagues seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about cybersecurity trends and digital transformation challenges. I found myself relaxing into the discussion, sharing stories about recent projects and the evolving landscape of corporate security threats. For a moment, I felt like maybe this gathering would be different, that my professional achievements might actually be recognized and respected in this setting. Marcus Chen arrived just as we were transitioning from appetizers to the main meal, and I felt a wave of relief at seeing a familiar face from my actual world. He worked as a senior analyst at one of Austin's largest tech firms, and we'd become close friends after meeting at a cybersecurity conference 2 years earlier. Marcus had the kind of easy confidence that came from being genuinely good at what he did, and he never seemed intimidated by social situations that made me feel like I was performing in a play where everyone else knew the script. "Sorry, I'm late," he said, shaking David's hand and greeting my parents warmly. "Client call ran long, you know how it is." "Actually, I don't," David replied with a chuckle that had an edge to it. "In consulting, we make it a point to respect our clients' time and our own. But I suppose the tech world operates differently." Marcus raised an eyebrow but kept his tone light. "Different industries, different rhythms. Jessica probably knows that better than anyone. Juggling multiple clients and security incidents that don't exactly stick to business hours." I appreciated the support, but something about the way David's expression shifted made me wary. He took a long sip of his beer, and then leaned back in his chair with the kind of relaxed posture that usually preceded his more pronounced opinions. "You know, I've been thinking about that," he said, directing his attention toward me. "This whole cybersecurity consulting thing. It's interesting work, I'm sure, but I have to wonder about the long-term career trajectory. I mean, it's essentially entry-level IT work dressed up with fancy terminology, right?" The patio fell silent except for the continued sizzling of the grill. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar sensation of being simultaneously furious and caught off guard that I'd experienced countless times throughout my childhood, when adults dismissed my interests or achievements. But this was different. This wasn't a well-meaning relative who didn't understand technology. This was my brother-in-law, speaking with the authority of someone who supposedly understood business and career advancement, reducing 3 years of building a successful consulting practice to entry-level IT work. "I'm not sure I follow," I said carefully, setting down my beer and turning to face him fully. "Could you elaborate on what you mean by entry-level?" David's smile had that patronizing quality I'd learned to recognize in certain client meetings, the expression of someone who believed they were about to educate me on something I didn't understand about my own field. "Well, look at the fundamentals. You're essentially providing technical support services to companies who don't want to hire full-time IT staff. It's outsourced maintenance work, which is fine, but it's not exactly strategic business consulting." I felt Marcus tense beside me, and I caught my father's confused expression from across the patio. My parents might not understand the technical details of my work, but they knew their daughter well enough to recognize when she was being dismissed. "David," Becca said quietly, "maybe we should." "No, it's fine," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I think it's important to address misconceptions about what cybersecurity consulting actually involves." I took a breath and looked directly at David, drawing on the same calm confidence I used when presenting security assessments to skeptical executives. Last month, I led a team that identified and helped remediate a security vulnerability that could have exposed the personal financial information of over 2 million customers for a major banking client. The week before that, I designed and implemented a security architecture overhaul for a healthcare system that needed to comply with new federal regulations while maintaining operational efficiency. Yesterday, I was on a call with the C-suite of a Fortune 500 manufacturing company, walking them through the strategic implications of a supply chain security incident that could have shut down their operations across 3 states. The patio had gone completely quiet now, even the ambient sounds of suburban evenings seeming to fade into the background. David's confident expression had shifted slightly, but he maintained his posture of casual authority. "Those are impressive projects," he conceded, but you're still essentially a vendor providing technical services. In real consulting, we're strategic partners who help companies transform their entire business operations. We sit at the leadership table and drive decisions that affect every aspect of an organization's future. And what table would that be? I asked, my tone still conversational but with an undercurrent that everyone present could feel. Because in my experience, cybersecurity has become one of the most critical strategic concerns for every major corporation in America. When a company's entire digital infrastructure is at risk, when a single security breach can cost millions in lost revenue and destroyed reputation, the people who understand how to protect and rebuild those systems aren't just vendors. They're essential strategic partners. Marcus jumped in, his voice carrying the kind of professional authority that came from years of working with executive leadership teams. Jessica's absolutely right. The cybersecurity landscape has fundamentally changed the way companies think about risk management and operational continuity. The consultants who understand both the technical and strategic implications of digital security are some of the most sought-after professionals in the business world right now. David's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his casual demeanor. I'm not trying to diminish anyone's work here. I'm just saying that there's a difference between technical services and strategic business consulting. In my field, we're helping companies completely reimagine their organizational structures, their market positioning, their competitive advantages. We're not just fixing problems, we're creating entirely new possibilities for growth and innovation. And what happens to all those innovative organizational structures and competitive advantages when someone breaches their network security and steals their intellectual property? I asked. What happens to that carefully planned market positioning when a cyber attack brings down their customer-facing systems for a week? What happens to all those possibilities for growth when their clients' personal data ends up for sale on the dark web? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see David processing the Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Implications. But instead of acknowledging the validity of my point, he doubled down with the kind of professional arrogance that I'd encountered in boardrooms, where executives believed their traditional business expertise automatically translated to understanding every aspect of modern corporate operations. Look, I respect the technical skills required for your work, he said, and I could hear the careful condescension in his phrasing. But at the end of the day, you're responding to problems that other people create. You're in a reactive position, not a proactive one. Real strategic consultants help companies get ahead of challenges and opportunities, not just respond to them after they've already become crises. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach, the kind of anger that came not from a single comment but from a lifetime of being underestimated by people who should have known better. This wasn't just about my career anymore. It was about every time I'd been dismissed or minimized. Every time someone had assumed that because I was young, female, or working in a technical field, I must be somehow less strategic, less important, less capable of seeing the bigger picture. Reactive, I repeated, letting the word hang between us. That's an interesting perspective, David. Tell me, what's Thompson & Associates' cybersecurity strategy for your own firm? He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. We have IT services that handle our basic security needs. Standard stuff, firewalls, antivirus, that kind of thing. And when was your last security audit? When did you last assess your vulnerability to social engineering attacks? What's your incident response plan if someone compromises your client database? David's confident expression was starting to crack around the edges. We have professionals who handle those details. I focus on the strategic business relationships and growth opportunities. Right, I said, my voice still calm but with an edge that everyone could feel. So you're telling me that while you're helping your clients reimagine their organizational structures, you're relying on other people to protect the very systems that make those structures possible. You're planning competitive advantages while hoping someone else is making sure your competitors can't steal your strategies right out of your own servers. Marcus was trying to hide a smile behind his beer bottle, and I noticed that my father had stopped pretending to tend the grill and was listening intently to the conversation. My mother looked worried, the way she always did when family tensions started to surface. But there was something else in her expression too, a kind of proud recognition that her daughter wasn't backing down from a challenge. It's not about hoping, David said, his voice losing some of its casual authority. It's about delegating appropriate responsibilities to qualified professionals while maintaining focus on strategic priorities. And what makes you think that cybersecurity isn't a strategic priority? I asked. What makes you think that understanding digital risk management isn't just as important as understanding market positioning or organizational development? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment I thought I might have actually made my point. But then his expression hardened, and I recognized the look of someone who'd been challenged in front of colleagues and family and wasn't about to admit they might be wrong. Because, he said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that suggested he was done with the discussion, at the end of the day, technology is just a tool. The real business happens in relationships, in strategic thinking, in understanding how to create value for clients and stakeholders. That's what separates entry-level technical work from actual consulting. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were particularly harsh, but because they revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of what I'd spent years building. David wasn't just dismissing my work, he was dismissing the entire concept that technical expertise could be strategic, that understanding complex systems could be just as valuable as understanding market dynamics or organizational psychology. I looked around the patio, taking in the faces of my family and David's colleagues, trying to gauge their reactions to his assessment. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed genuinely curious about how I would respond, and a few appeared to be waiting for me to either back down or escalate the conflict. But what struck me most was the realization that this moment had been building for months, maybe years, through countless subtle interactions, where David had positioned himself as the business expert and me as the technical specialist, as if those were fundamentally different categories of professional competence. "You know what, David," I said, standing up and reaching for my purse. "I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one. But I appreciate you sharing your perspective so clearly. It's given me a lot to think about." Becca looked panicked, clearly recognizing that I was preparing to leave. "Jess, come on, we haven't even had cake yet. Can't we just change the subject?" I gave her a smile that I hoped looked more genuine than it felt. "I've got an early morning tomorrow anyway. Client emergency that can't wait for regular business hours, you know how it is." As I hugged my parents goodbye and shook hands with David's colleagues, I could feel the tension radiating from everyone present. David himself seemed to realize that the conversation had ended awkwardly, and he made a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over. "Hey, no hard feelings, right? I didn't mean to sound dismissive of your work. I just think there are different levels of business impact, that's all." I looked at him for a long moment, taking in his carefully styled hair and expensive clothes, his confident posture and practiced smile. He was successful, no doubt about it, and he'd built a consulting practice that generated significant revenue and maintained impressive client relationships. But standing there in his backyard, surrounded by the symbols of his professional achievements, I realized that David Thompson had just made a critical error in judgment that would have consequences he couldn't possibly imagine. "No hard feelings at all," I said, my voice warm and genuine. "Like I said, it's given me a lot to think about. And David, thanks for the reminder about the importance of strategic thinking. I have a feeling that's going to be really valuable in the coming months." As I walked back through their house toward the front door, I heard Marcus making his own polite excuses to leave, and I waited for him by my car in the driveway. When he emerged a few minutes later, he was shaking his head with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "That was something else," he said, leaning against my car. "I've never seen someone so confidently wrong about something they clearly don't understand." "The thing is," I said, pulling out my phone to check the messages that had been accumulating during dinner, "he's not wrong about the importance of strategic thinking. He's just wrong about what qualifies as strategic in today's business environment." Marcus grinned. "I get the feeling David Thompson is about to learn that lesson the hard way." I smiled back, feeling a sense of clarity that had been building throughout the evening. "You know what? I think you might be right about that." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Austin, I found myself thinking about the conversation in ways that had nothing to do with hurt feelings or family dynamics. David had inadvertently revealed something important about his own understanding of business strategy and risk management. He'd shown me exactly how traditional consulting firms like Thompson and Associates viewed cybersecurity, and more importantly, He demonstrated the kinds of blind spots that created opportunities for people who understood both technology and business strategy. By the time I reached my apartment, I had 17 new messages about security incidents, 3 voicemails from potential clients, and a growing sense that the evening's confrontation had been less about family tensions and more about a fundamental shift in how business was conducted in the modern world. David Thompson thought he understood the difference between technical services and strategic consulting, but he'd just proven that he didn't understand the most important strategic challenge facing every business in America. And that, I realized as I settled into my home office to handle the evening's client emergencies, was exactly the kind of knowledge gap that created career opportunities for people who were paying attention. The weeks following the barbecue passed in a strange blur of normalcy, punctuated by moments that felt like aftershocks from an earthquake I hadn't fully processed yet. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, partly because 3 major clients were dealing with simultaneous security incidents, and partly because staying busy kept me from dwelling on the way David's words had lodged themselves in my brain like splinters. My days started before sunrise with security briefings and incident reports, followed by client calls that stretched well into the evening. The retail chain breach I'd been monitoring escalated into a full-scale crisis that required round-the-clock coordination between my team, their internal IT department, and federal investigators. We spent 72 hours straight in what I privately called war room mode, fueled by coffee and the kind of focused adrenaline that came from knowing that millions of people's personal information hung in the balance. When we finally contained the breach and implemented the necessary security protocols, the client's CEO personally called to thank me. He was a man in his 60s who'd built his company from a single store into a nationwide chain, and his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what could have been lost. "Jessica," he said, "I need you to know that what you and your team did this week wasn't just technical support. You saved our company's reputation and probably kept us out of bankruptcy court. I've been in business for 40 years, and I've never seen strategic thinking and execution like this under pressure." I thanked him and hung up the phone, but his words echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. Strategic thinking and execution, the exact phrases David had used to describe what separated real consulting from technical services. I found myself wondering if he'd ever received a call like that from a client, if he'd ever been in a position where his expertise literally saved a company from collapse. But even as I celebrated the successful resolution of the crisis, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during that barbecue conversation. It wasn't just that David had dismissed my work. It was that he'd done it with such confidence, such certainty that he understood the broader business context better than I did. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that his attitude reflected a deeper misunderstanding of how modern businesses actually operated. Ryan called that Friday evening as I was finally leaving the office after the longest week I'd had in months. We'd been dating for about 6 months, and he had the kind of steady, supportive presence that made even the most stressful days feel manageable. He worked as a project manager for a green energy startup, and his understanding of both technical challenges and business strategy made him one of the few people who could follow my work stories without needing extensive background explanations. "How's the hero of the retail world doing?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I saw the news coverage about the breach. They made it sound like you single-handedly prevented a digital apocalypse." "Hardly single-handed," I said, settling into my car and putting the call on speaker. "But it was definitely a team effort worth celebrating. Want to grab dinner and hear all the gory details?" "Actually," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "I was wondering if you'd be up for something a little different. My company's having a networking event, Night, and I thought you might enjoy meeting some of the other entrepreneurs in the Austin tech scene. Plus, I have a feeling you could use some time around people who actually understand what you do for a living." The invitation hit me in an unexpected way, highlighting just how isolated I'd been feeling lately. Between the demanding client work and the lingering tension from the family barbecue, I'd spent most of my time either with my small team at TechFlow or alone in my apartment, analyzing security logs and preparing incident reports. The idea of socializing with other professionals who shared my perspective on technology and business strategy felt like exactly what I needed. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Fair warning, though, I might be a little rusty on small talk. I've spent the last week speaking primarily in technical acronyms and crisis management protocols, Ryan laughed. Trust me, that's going to be a feature, not a bug, with this crowd. Half the conversations will probably be about scaling challenges and market disruption theories. The networking event was held at a trendy rooftop bar in downtown Austin, the kind of place where startup founders and venture capitalists gathered to discuss funding rounds and growth strategies while watching the sunset over the city skyline. I arrived fashionably late, having spent longer than usual choosing an outfit that struck the right balance between professional competence and approachable confidence. Ryan met me at the entrance, looking comfortable in his element as he guided me through the crowd and made introductions. The attendees were a mix of entrepreneurs, investors, and established professionals from various sectors of the tech industry, and I found myself relaxing into conversations about artificial intelligence applications, blockchain security, and the challenges of scaling technical teams. About an hour into the event, I found myself talking with Sarah Kim, a venture capitalist who specialized in cybersecurity investments. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp, analytical mind that came from years of evaluating companies and predicting market trends. When I mentioned TechFlow Solutions, her eyes lit up with genuine interest. "I've been hearing your name around town," she said, leaning in with the focused attention of someone who'd identified a potentially valuable connection. "The retail breach resolution last week was impressive, but I'm more interested in the consulting model you've built. There's a real gap in the market for firms that can bridge technical expertise and strategic business planning." "That's exactly what I've been thinking," I said, surprised by how eager I was to discuss the business side of my work with someone who understood both the technical and financial implications. Most cybersecurity firms are either highly technical with limited business insight, or they're traditional consulting companies that outsource the actual technical work. I've been trying to build something that combines both approaches. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The challenge is scalability, right? You can't personally handle every major client engagement, but finding people who understand both the technical and strategic aspects is incredibly difficult." "Exactly," I said, feeling a surge of excitement at finding someone who immediately grasped the fundamental challenge I'd been wrestling with. "I've been considering whether to focus on growing the technical team or developing more strategic partnerships with traditional consulting firms." "Have you thought about the third option?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the kind of careful interest that suggested she'd already thought through the implications. "What if you positioned TechFlow as a strategic consulting firm that happens to have deep technical expertise, rather than a technical firm trying to add strategic services?" The question stopped me cold, not because I didn't understand what she was suggesting, but because it reframed everything I'd been thinking about my business in a way that suddenly made perfect sense. Instead of trying to convince traditional consulting firms that cybersecurity was strategically important, what if I positioned my firm as a strategic consulting practice that specialized in the kinds of complex, high-stakes problems that traditional firms weren't equipped to handle? "That's brilliant," I said, my mind already racing through the implications. Instead of competing with traditional consulting on their terms, I'd be defining a new category of strategic consulting that they can't compete with. Sarah smiled. "Now you're thinking like a venture capitalist. The most successful companies don't just serve existing markets better, they create entirely new markets that didn't exist before." We talked for another hour, exploring the possibilities of repositioning TechFlow as a strategic consulting firm focused on digital transformation and cyber risk management. Sarah shared insights about other companies that had successfully bridged technical expertise and strategic consulting, and she offered to introduce me to some of her portfolio companies that might be interested in strategic partnerships. By the time the event wound down, I felt like I'd gained a completely new perspective on the business I'd been building. The conversation with Sarah had crystallized something that had been forming in my mind since the barbecue confrontation with David. I wasn't just running a technical services company. I was developing a new approach to strategic consulting that traditional firms like Thompson and Associates couldn't replicate. The drive home gave me time to process everything I'd learned, and I found myself thinking about David's dismissive comments in a completely different light. His assumption that technical expertise couldn't be strategic had revealed a fundamental blind spot in how traditional consulting firms approached modern business challenges. While he was helping clients with organizational restructuring and market positioning, he was completely missing the digital transformation issues that were reshaping every industry. Over the following weeks, I began implementing some of the ideas that had emerged from my conversation with Sarah. I started repositioning TechFlow's marketing materials to emphasize strategic consulting rather than technical services, and I began reaching out to potential clients with a different kind of value proposition. Instead of offering to fix their security problems, I started offering to help them understand how cybersecurity strategy could drive competitive advantage and business growth. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Companies that had never considered cybersecurity a strategic priority suddenly wanted to discuss how digital security could support their expansion plans and market positioning. I found myself in boardrooms talking with C-suite executives about risk management frameworks and digital transformation strategies, exactly the kinds of high-level business conversations that David had insisted were beyond the scope of technical consulting. But the real breakthrough came when Marcus called me on a Tuesday morning with news that would change everything. He was barely able to contain his excitement as he launched into the story of a conversation he'd had with his company's CEO the previous day. "Jessica, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice carrying the kind of breathless enthusiasm that suggested he'd been waiting all night to share this information. "My CEO mentioned that Thompson & Associates is pitching for a massive digital transformation contract with Austin Metropolitan Bank. We're talking about a complete overhaul of their entire technology infrastructure, client-facing systems, everything." I felt my pulse quicken. Austin Metropolitan was one of the largest regional banks in Texas, and a digital transformation project of that scope would be worth millions of dollars. More importantly, it was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes engagement that required both traditional business consulting expertise and deep technical knowledge. "That's huge," I said, already thinking through the implications. "Thompson & Associates has the business consulting credentials to win a contract like that, but they'd need serious technical partners to actually deliver the implementation." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And here's the really interesting part. My CEO knows someone on the bank's board, and apparently they're concerned about cybersecurity implications of the digital transformation. They want to make sure that any consulting firm they hire has the technical expertise to address security concerns throughout the implementation process." I sat down hard in my desk chair, my mind racing through the possibilities. This was exactly the kind of opportunity that Sarah had been describing, a chance to position TechFlow as a strategic consulting partner rather than a technical subcontractor. If I could find a way to get involved in the Austin Metropolitan project, it would represent a fundamental shift in how my company operated and how the market perceived my expertise. "Marcus," I said slowly, "do you think your CEO would be willing to make an introduction, not to compete with Thompson & Associates, but to discuss potential partnership opportunities?" "I think he'd be very interested in that conversation," Marcus said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Especially if it meant helping a local company get involved in a major strategic project." That afternoon, I found myself staring at my computer screen, trying to draft an email that would position TechFlow as a strategic consulting partner worthy of consideration for the Austin Metropolitan project. It was a delicate balance between confidence and humility, between showcasing my technical expertise and demonstrating my understanding of broader business strategy. But as I wrote, I kept thinking about David's dismissive comments about entry-level technical work. He'd been so certain that cybersecurity consulting was fundamentally different from strategic business consulting, so confident that his understanding of organizational development and market positioning represented a higher level of professional expertise. The Austin Metropolitan project would be a perfect test of that assumption. The email I finally sent was carefully crafted to emphasize TechFlow's unique position as a strategic consulting firm, with deep technical expertise in cybersecurity and digital transformation. I outlined our recent successes with similar projects, highlighted the strategic business value of our approach, and suggested that the complexity of the Austin Metropolitan project would require the kind of integrated technical and strategic thinking that traditional consulting firms often struggled to provide. The response came back within hours. Austin Metropolitan's chief technology officer wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. He'd been following the recent developments in cybersecurity consulting and was interested in exploring partnerships with firms that could bridge the gap between technical implementation and strategic business planning. I spent the rest of the week preparing for the meeting, researching Austin Metropolitan's current technology infrastructure, and developing a comprehensive analysis of the cybersecurity challenges they would face during a digital transformation project. But more importantly, I spent time thinking about how to position TechFlow's role in ways that would complement rather than compete with whatever traditional consulting firm ultimately won the primary contract. The meeting took place in Austin Metropolitan's downtown headquarters, a gleaming tower that symbolized the kind of established financial institution that was struggling to adapt to the digital age. The CTO, Robert Martinez, was a man in his 50s who'd spent his career watching technology evolve from a back-office function to a strategic business priority. "Ms. Martinez," he said, settling into his chair across from me in the conference room, "I'll be direct with you. We're looking at a digital transformation project that will touch every aspect of our operations. We need consulting partners who understand both the technical complexities and the strategic implications of what we're trying to accomplish." I leaned forward, recognizing the opening I'd been hoping for. "Mr. Martinez, I appreciate your directness, and I'd like to be equally straightforward with you. Most traditional consulting firms are excellent at organizational strategy and change management, but they often underestimate the cybersecurity implications of digital transformation. Most cybersecurity firms are technically competent, but they don't understand how security considerations should inform strategic business decisions." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "And TechFlow Solutions occupies the space between those two approaches?" "Not between them," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Beyond them. We've developed a methodology that treats cybersecurity as a strategic business function rather than a technical compliance requirement. When we work with clients on digital transformation projects, we're not just implementing security protocols, we're helping them understand how security architecture can support their competitive strategy and business growth." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Robert asking increasingly detailed questions about my approach to strategic cybersecurity consulting. He was particularly interested in case studies from recent projects, and I found myself sharing stories about how TechFlow had helped other companies turn security challenges into competitive advantages. By the end of the meeting, Robert had made it clear that Austin Metropolitan was interested in working with TechFlow, but not as a subcontractor to whatever traditional consulting firm won the primary contract. Instead, they wanted to explore a parallel consulting relationship, where TechFlow would provide strategic cybersecurity guidance directly to the bank's executive team, while coordinating with the primary consulting firm on implementation details. "This is exactly the kind of partnership we've been looking for," Robert said as we wrapped up the meeting. "We need someone who can help us think strategically about security throughout the entire transformation process, not just review technical specifications after the fact." I drove home that evening with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in months. The Austin Metropolitan project represented everything I'd been working toward. A chance to demonstrate that cybersecurity consulting could be just as strategic and high-level as any traditional business consulting engagement. More importantly, it was an opportunity to prove that the technical expertise David had dismissed as entry-level was actually the foundation for a new kind of strategic consulting that traditional firms couldn't replicate. But there was something else about the opportunity that made it particularly satisfying. Marcus had mentioned that Thompson and Associates was pitching for the primary consulting contract, which meant that David would likely be involved in the project if his firm won the engagement. The possibility of working alongside him as a strategic partner rather than a technical subcontractor was almost too perfect to believe. I spent the weekend developing a comprehensive proposal for the Austin Metropolitan engagement, outlining how TechFlow could provide strategic cybersecurity guidance throughout the digital transformation process. The proposal emphasized our unique position as a consulting firm that combined deep technical expertise with strategic business thinking, exactly the kind of integrated approach that traditional consulting firms often struggled to provide. But as I worked on the proposal, I found myself thinking less about the technical details and more about the broader implications of what I was trying to accomplish. The Austin Metropolitan project wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a chance to demonstrate that the future of consulting required a different kind of expertise than what had been successful in the past. Monday morning brought a call from Robert Martinez with news that would set everything in motion. Austin Metropolitan had decided to move forward with the dual consulting approach, and they wanted TechFlow to begin the strategic cybersecurity assessment immediately. The primary consulting contract was still being finalized, but they were confident that the winning firm would be receptive to collaborative partnerships. "There's one more thing," Robert said, his tone carrying a note of amusement. The firm that's most likely to win the primary contract is Thompson and Associates. I believe you mentioned that you're familiar with their work? I paused, feeling a smile spread across my face as I considered the perfect irony of the situation. Yes, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral, I'm very familiar with their approach to strategic consulting. Excellent, Robert said. I have a feeling this is going to be a very interesting project for everyone involved. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the conversation with David at the barbecue had set in motion a chain of events that would soon bring us together in a very different context. Instead of dismissing my work as entry-level technical services, he would have to collaborate with me as a strategic partner on one of the most important projects his firm had ever undertaken. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I assembled a team of my best consultants and began developing the strategic cybersecurity framework that would guide Austin Metropolitan through their digital transformation. The work was complex and challenging, requiring us to think through every aspect of how security considerations should inform business strategy and operational planning. But even as I focused on the technical and strategic challenges of the project, I couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming collaboration with Thompson and Associates. David had been so confident that his understanding of strategic consulting was fundamentally different from and superior to my technical expertise. The Austin Metropolitan project would give us both a chance to test that assumption in the most direct way possible. The call confirming Thompson and Associates as the primary consulting firm came on a Thursday afternoon, followed immediately by a request for a coordination meeting between the two consulting teams. As I marked the date on my calendar, I felt a surge of anticipation mixed with nervous energy. Everything I'd been working toward since that barbecue conversation was about to be put to the test. The stage was set for a collaboration that would either validate David's assumptions about the hierarchy of business expertise or demonstrate that the future of strategic consulting required a very different kind of knowledge than what had been successful in the past. Either way, it was going to be an education for both of us. The first joint meeting between TechFlow Solutions and Thompson and Associates was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Austin Metropolitan's executive conference room. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly from professional habit, and partly because I wanted to observe the dynamics as David's team entered the room. I'd spent the weekend mentally preparing for this moment, running through various scenarios of how our professional reunion might unfold. The conference room was everything you'd expect from a major financial institution, with polished mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin, and the kind of technological infrastructure that suggested serious money had been invested in creating the right atmosphere for high-stakes business discussions. I set up my materials at one end of the long table, arranging my laptop, project folders, and the comprehensive cybersecurity assessment I'd been developing for the past 3 weeks. Robert Martinez arrived a few minutes later, followed by 2 other Austin Metropolitan executives who would be overseeing different aspects of the digital transformation project. We exchanged pleasantries and reviewed the agenda for the meeting, which focused on establishing coordination protocols between the 2 consulting teams and identifying potential areas of overlap or conflict. David's team made their entrance at exactly 9 o'clock, a perfectly timed arrival that suggested they'd been waiting in the lobby to make the right impression. David himself led the group, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, followed by 3 other Thompson and Associates consultants who carried themselves with the kind of confident professionalism that came from years of working with Fortune 500 clients. When David saw me sitting at the conference table, his step faltered for just a moment before he recovered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Jessica, what a pleasant surprise. I didn't realize you'd be involved in this project." "Good morning, David," I said, rising to shake his hand with the kind of professional courtesy that gave no hint of our personal history. "I'm looking forward to working together on this engagement." Robert Martinez stepped in to handle the introductions, explaining how TechFlow Solutions had been brought in to provide strategic cybersecurity guidance, while Thompson and Associates would lead the overall digital transformation initiative. As he spoke, I watched David's expression shift from mild confusion to something approaching disbelief. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice carrying a note of polite incredulity, "but I want to make sure I understand the arrangement correctly. TechFlow will be providing cybersecurity consulting services as a subcontractor to Thompson and Associates?" Actually, Robert said, his tone matter-of-fact, both firms will be working directly with Austin Metropolitan as strategic partners. TechFlow will be providing strategic cybersecurity guidance, while Thompson & Associates handles the broader organizational transformation aspects of the project. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I could see him processing the implications of what he'd just heard. In his mind, there was clearly a hierarchy of consulting services, with strategic business consulting at the top and technical services somewhere below. The idea that my firm would be working as an equal partner rather than a subordinate contractor was obviously not what he'd expected. "That's an interesting approach," David said carefully, his tone diplomatic but strained. "In our experience, it's usually more efficient to have a single consulting firm coordinate all aspects of a project like this, with technical specialists brought in as needed for specific deliverables." "Under normal circumstances, I'd agree with you," Robert replied. "But this project involves such complex cybersecurity considerations that we felt it was important to have strategic security expertise embedded throughout the entire process, not just brought in for technical reviews." I remained silent during this exchange, recognizing that David was trying to establish the consulting hierarchy he was comfortable with, while Robert was explaining why Austin Metropolitan had specifically chosen a different approach. The tension was subtle but unmistakable, and I could see David's team members exchanging glances as they began to understand the dynamics they'd be working within. The meeting proceeded with a detailed review of the project timeline and deliverables, with both consulting teams presenting their approaches to different aspects of the digital transformation. When it came time for me to present TechFlow's strategic cybersecurity framework, I watched David's expression carefully as I outlined how security considerations would inform every aspect of the project planning and implementation. "As you can see," I said, concluding my presentation, "we're not just looking at cybersecurity as a technical compliance requirement. We're treating it as a strategic business function that will influence everything from customer experience design to operational efficiency optimization." One of David's team members, a senior consultant named Patricia Williams, raised her hand with a question that felt more like a challenge. "That's a comprehensive approach, but I'm curious about how you plan to coordinate with our organizational change management initiatives. In our experience, technical security requirements often conflict with the kind of operational flexibility that successful digital transformation requires." It was a good question, and I could see that Patricia was testing whether I understood the broader business implications of what I was proposing. But there was also something in her tone that suggested she shared David's assumptions about the hierarchy of consulting expertise. "That's exactly why we've developed an integrated approach," I said, pulling up a slide that showed how security architecture could support rather than constrain operational flexibility. Traditional cybersecurity implementations often create conflicts with business objectives, because they're designed as after-the-fact compliance measures rather than strategic business enablers. When security considerations are embedded in the strategic planning process from the beginning, they actually enhance operational capabilities rather than limiting them. I spent the next 20 minutes walking through case studies from recent projects, demonstrating how TechFlow's approach had helped other companies achieve both security objectives and business growth targets. The Austin Metropolitan executives seemed engaged and impressed, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. But David's team maintained a polite but skeptical demeanor throughout the presentation, and I could sense their discomfort with the idea that cybersecurity consulting could be genuinely strategic rather than simply technical. When I finished, David leaned forward with the kind of expression that suggested he was about to offer helpful clarification. "Jessica's presentation raises some interesting points," he said, his tone carefully diplomatic. "But I think it's important to maintain perspective on the scope of different consulting functions. While cybersecurity is certainly important, the real strategic challenges in a digital transformation project involve organizational change management, process re-engineering, and cultural transformation. Those are the areas where senior leadership needs the most support and guidance." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt every person in the room turn their attention to see how I would respond. David had just publicly dismissed my strategic expertise in front of the client, suggesting that my work was important, but ultimately secondary to the real strategic challenges that his firm was equipped to handle. "I appreciate that perspective, David," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. But I'd like to respectfully disagree with the assumption that cybersecurity strategy is separate from organizational change management. In fact, I'd argue that digital transformation projects fail most often when companies treat cybersecurity as a technical add-on rather than a fundamental component of their strategic planning. I pulled up another slide, this one showing statistics about digital transformation failure rates and their correlation with cybersecurity incidents. According to recent industry research, 47% of digital transformation projects experience significant setbacks due to security-related issues that weren't adequately addressed during the planning phase. These aren't technical problems, they're strategic planning failures that cascade into operational disruptions, customer trust issues, and competitive disadvantages. David's expression tightened, and I could see him preparing to push back on my argument. But before he could speak, Robert Martinez intervened with a question that cut straight to the heart of the discussion. David, given those statistics, how does Thompson and Associates typically address cybersecurity considerations in your digital transformation projects? David straightened in his chair, clearly confident in his response. We work with qualified technical partners who handle the cybersecurity implementation according to industry best practices. Our role is to focus on the strategic business challenges and ensure that technical requirements don't interfere with operational objectives. And what happens when those technical requirements conflict with operational objectives? Robert asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational. That's where effective project management comes in, David said, his voice carrying the kind of assured confidence that suggested he'd handled similar questions many times before. We mediate between technical constraints and business requirements to find solutions that optimize overall project outcomes. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I listened to David's response. He was describing exactly the kind of reactive problem-solving approach that I'd spent years trying to move beyond. Instead of treating cybersecurity as a strategic consideration that should inform business planning, he was positioning it as a technical constraint that needed to be managed and minimized. That's an interesting approach, I said, my voice remaining professional despite the frustration building in my chest. But I wonder if it might be more effective to treat cybersecurity as a strategic asset rather than a technical constraint. When security architecture is designed to support business objectives from the beginning, it actually enhances operational capabilities rather than limiting them. David leaned back in his chair with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jessica, I think we're getting into a semantic discussion about the definition of strategic. In business consulting, strategic thinking means understanding how different organizational functions support overall business objectives. Technical implementation, no matter how sophisticated, is still ultimately a tactical consideration. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were particularly harsh, but because they revealed the fundamental disconnect between David's understanding of modern business challenges and the reality of what companies actually needed to succeed in a digital economy. He was still thinking in terms of organizational hierarchies that separated strategic planning from technical implementation, apparently oblivious to the fact that digital transformation had made that separation not just artificial but actively counterproductive. I looked around the conference room, taking in the faces of the Austin metropolitan executives who would be making decisions about how to proceed with this project. They were listening intently to the discussion, clearly trying to understand the implications of the different approaches being proposed. But I could see uncertainty in their expressions, the kind of doubt that came from hearing two consulting teams present fundamentally different philosophies about how to approach the same challenge. Patricia Williams jumped in with a comment that seemed designed to support David's position. I think David's point about strategic versus tactical considerations is crucial here. While cybersecurity is certainly important, the real value that senior consulting firms provide is helping companies think through the bigger picture implications of major business initiatives. That's where decades of experience working with C-suite executives and board members becomes invaluable. I felt a surge of anger that I struggled to keep out of my voice. Patricia, can I ask you something? When you're working with C-suite executives on digital transformation strategy, do you discuss the potential business impact of a major cybersecurity incident? Do you help them understand how security architecture decisions will affect customer trust, regulatory compliance, and competitive positioning? Patricia's confident expression faltered slightly. Well, those are certainly considerations that come up in our discussions. but we rely on technical specialists to provide guidance on the specific implementation details. But what if the implementation details are actually strategic decisions? I pressed. What if the choice between different security architectures has fundamental implications for how the company can operate, how they can serve customers, and how they can compete in their market? David interrupted before Patricia could respond, his voice carrying a note of irritation that suggested he was tired of the theoretical discussion. Jessica, I think you're overcomplicating this. Cybersecurity is important, but it's still a support function for the broader business objectives. When we're helping companies transform their operations, we focus on the strategic priorities that will drive growth and competitive advantage. Technical considerations like security architecture are important, but they're not the primary drivers of business success. I stared at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything I'd been trying to prove since that barbecue conversation. David wasn't just dismissing my work. He was dismissing the entire concept that technical expertise could be strategically valuable. In his mind, there was a clear hierarchy of business functions, with strategic consulting at the top and technical services somewhere below, and no amount of evidence or explanation was going to change that fundamental assumption. David, I said, my voice steady but with an edge that everyone in the room could hear. I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this point, but I'd like to propose an alternative approach to this project that might address some of the concerns we've been discussing. I pulled up a new slide that showed an integrated project timeline where cybersecurity strategy was embedded throughout the entire digital transformation process, rather than treated as a separate technical workstream. Instead of having TechFlow provide technical support to Thompson and Associates' strategic initiatives, what if we structured the collaboration so that both firms are working together on truly integrated strategic planning? This would ensure that security considerations inform business strategy from the beginning, while business objectives guide security architecture decisions. Robert Martinez leaned forward, clearly interested in the proposal. Can you walk us through what that would look like in practice? I spent the next 15 minutes outlining a collaborative approach that would integrate strategic cybersecurity planning with organizational change management, showing how the two consulting teams could work together to address both technical and business challenges simultaneously. The presentation was detailed and comprehensive, drawing on case studies from similar projects and demonstrating clear business value for the integrated approach. But as I spoke, I could see David's expression growing increasingly skeptical. When I finished, he leaned forward with the kind of patronizing smile that I'd learned to recognize as a prelude to professional dismissal. Jessica, that's a very thorough presentation, but I'm concerned about the complexity of the coordination required for that kind of integrated approach. In our experience, successful consulting projects require clear roles and responsibilities, with each firm focusing on their core areas of expertise. When you try to blur those lines, you often end up with confusion and inefficiency. I felt my chest tighten with the familiar frustration of being dismissed by someone who refused to acknowledge the validity of my expertise. David, I understand your concerns about coordination complexity, but I think you're underestimating the strategic value of integrated planning. The most successful digital transformation projects we've worked on have been the ones where security considerations were embedded throughout the strategic planning process, not treated as a separate technical workstream. But that's exactly my point, David said, his tone becoming more animated as he warmed to his argument. You're talking about embedding technical considerations in strategic planning, but that's not how strategic consulting works. Strategic planning is about understanding market dynamics, competitive positioning, organizational capabilities, and growth opportunities. Technical implementation comes after those strategic decisions have been made. I looked around the conference room again, seeing the Austin metropolitan executives watching this exchange with growing concern. They'd brought in two consulting firms to collaborate on a major project, and instead they were witnessing a fundamental disagreement about how that collaboration should work. David, I said, my voice carrying a note of finality. I think we've identified a fundamental difference in how we approach digital transformation projects. You see cybersecurity as a technical implementation detail that should be managed after strategic decisions are made. I see it as a strategic business function that should inform those decisions from the beginning. And that's exactly the problem, David said, his diplomatic facade finally slipping to reveal the frustration and condescension that had been building throughout the meeting. You're confusing technical expertise with strategic thinking. Just because cybersecurity is important doesn't mean that cybersecurity consultants are strategic business advisors. There's a reason why companies hire firms like Thompson and Associates to lead digital transformation projects and firms like TechFlow to handle the technical implementation. The silence that followed was deafening. David had just publicly dismissed my strategic expertise in front of the client, reducing my role to technical implementation despite everything I'd presented about TechFlow's approach to strategic cybersecurity consulting. But more than that, he'd done it with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he genuinely believed he was stating an obvious truth about the hierarchy of business expertise. I felt something break inside me, not from hurt or disappointment, but from the sudden clarity of understanding exactly what I was dealing with. David wasn't just underestimating my capabilities, he was fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of modern business challenges. His worldview was built on assumptions about the separation between strategic planning and technical implementation that had become not just outdated, but actively harmful to his client's success. "You know what, David?" I said, my voice calm and controlled despite the anger building in my chest. "I think you've made your position very clear, and I think it's important for everyone in this room to understand the implications of what you're saying." I turned to face Robert Martinez and the other Austin Metropolitan executives, speaking directly to them rather than continuing to engage with David's team. What David is describing is a traditional approach to digital transformation that treats cybersecurity as a technical compliance requirement rather than a strategic business function. That approach might have worked 5 years ago, but it's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to the project failures I showed you in those statistics. Robert looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that the collaboration he'd hoped for was falling apart in real time. "Jessica, perhaps we should take a break and discuss how to move forward with a more collaborative approach." "Actually," I said, my mind crystallizing around a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. "I think David has been very clear about how he sees this collaboration working. And I think it's important for Austin Metropolitan to understand that TechFlow Solutions doesn't operate as a technical subcontractor to strategic consulting firms. We're a strategic consulting firm that specializes in cybersecurity and digital transformation." I began packing up my materials, each movement deliberate and controlled. "If Austin Metropolitan is interested in truly integrated strategic planning for this digital transformation project, TechFlow would be happy to discuss how we can support that approach. But if you're looking for a technical services provider to implement decisions made by Thompson and Associates, then I think you need to find a different firm." David's expression shifted from smugness to alarm as he realized that I was preparing to walk away from the project entirely. "Jessica, I think you're overreacting to what was meant to be a collaborative discussion about project structure." I turned back to face him, my voice steady and professional. "David, you've been very clear about your view of collaborative project structure. You see TechFlow as a technical implementation partner that should support strategic decisions made by Thompson and Associates. I see TechFlow as a strategic consulting firm that should be collaborating with other strategic partners on integrated planning and implementation." I closed my laptop and picked up my project folders, feeling a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. "Robert, I'll send you a proposal for how TechFlow could approach this project as the primary strategic consulting partner, with technical implementation support from qualified subcontractors. If Austin Metropolitan is interested in that approach, we can discuss next steps. If not, I wish you the best of luck with your digital transformation initiative." As I walked toward the conference room door, I heard David's voice behind me, tight with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Jessica, you're making a mistake. Austin Metropolitan needs experienced strategic consulting support for a project of this scope. Technical firms don't have the organizational development expertise to manage complex business transformation initiatives." I paused at the door and turned back one last time, meeting David's eyes with the kind of direct, unwavering gaze that left no room for misinterpretation. "David, you're absolutely right about one thing. Technical firms don't have the organizational development expertise to manage complex business transformation initiatives. But TechFlow Solutions isn't a technical firm. We're a strategic consulting firm that happens to understand technology well enough to help companies use it effectively." I looked around the conference room one final time, taking in the shocked expressions of the Austin metropolitan executives and the stunned silence of David's team. The difference between those two approaches is going to become very clear over the next few months. I just hope Austin Metropolitan chooses the approach that will actually help them succeed in their digital transformation goals. As I walked out of the conference room and through the lobby of Austin Metropolitan's headquarters, I felt the kind of adrenaline rush that came from making a decision that would change everything. I just walked away from a major project and ended any possibility of working with David's firm, but I'd also made a statement about the value of strategic cybersecurity consulting that would resonate throughout the Austin business community. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave me time to process what had just happened. I'd gone into that meeting hoping to demonstrate that cybersecurity consulting could be strategic and valuable, and instead I'd been forced to choose between compromising my professional principles and walking away from a lucrative opportunity. The choice had been easier than I'd expected, but the implications were still sinking in. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already buzzing with messages. Robert Martinez had sent a text asking if I'd be willing to discuss alternative project structures, and Marcus had somehow already heard about the meeting and wanted to know if I was available for an emergency coffee consultation. But the message that caught my attention was from Sarah Kim, the venture capitalist I'd met at the networking event. Heard about the Austin Metropolitan meeting. Interested in discussing how TechFlow might be positioned for larger strategic consulting opportunities. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? I sat in my car for a moment, looking out at the Austin skyline, and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The confrontation with David had been building since that barbecue conversation, but it had finally crystallized around a fundamental question about the future of strategic consulting. I'd made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. But as I started the engine and pulled out of the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete clarity about my professional direction and the value of what I'd been building. David Thompson might understand traditional strategic consulting, but he was about to learn that the future belonged to people who understood how to integrate technical expertise with strategic thinking. The game was about to change, and I was finally ready to play it on my own terms. The lunch meeting with Sarah Kim took place at a quiet restaurant in the Warehouse District, the kind of place where venture capitalists conducted business over artisanal sandwiches and locally sourced coffee. I arrived with my laptop bag and a sense of cautious optimism, still processing the aftermath of the Austin Metropolitan meeting and what it meant for TechFlow's future direction. Sarah was already seated at a corner table, scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity of someone managing multiple investment portfolios simultaneously. When she saw me approaching, she looked up with the kind of sharp, analytical expression that had probably evaluated hundreds of business proposals over the years. "Jessica," she said, rising to shake my hand, "I heard about yesterday's meeting. Word travels fast in Austin consulting circles, especially when someone walks away from a major bank contract." I settled into my chair and ordered coffee, trying to gauge whether Sarah's tone suggested opportunity or concern. "I assume you heard David Thompson's version of events?" Sarah's smile was enigmatic. "I heard several versions, actually. David's contacts at the bank seemed to think you were being unreasonable about project scope. Your friend Marcus thinks you made a brilliant strategic move. Robert Martinez called me this morning asking about TechFlow's reputation and capabilities." The revelation that Robert had reached out to Sarah directly was both surprising and encouraging. It suggested that Austin Metropolitan was taking my proposal seriously, despite the dramatic way I'd ended the collaboration meeting. "What did you tell him?" I asked, genuinely curious about how an outside investor would evaluate the situation. I told him that TechFlow Solutions represents exactly the kind of strategic consulting firm that forward-thinking companies need for digital transformation projects, Sarah said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd made similar assessments many times before. I also told him that if Austin Metropolitan was serious about integrated cybersecurity strategy, they'd be foolish not to explore what you could offer as a primary consulting partner. I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with professional validation. Having a respected venture capitalist endorse my approach to strategic consulting was worth more than any amount of personal encouragement. "But that's not why I asked you to lunch," Sarah continued, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was about to propose something significant. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the networking event, and I think there's a much bigger opportunity here than just the Austin Metropolitan project." She pulled out a tablet and showed me a presentation that made my pulse quicken. The slides outlined a strategic expansion plan for TechFlow Solutions, positioning the company as a premier strategic consulting firm specializing in digital transformation and cybersecurity leadership for Fortune 500 companies. The market timing is perfect, Sarah explained, swiping through slides that showed market analysis and competitive positioning data. Traditional consulting firms like Thompson and Associates are struggling to adapt to the cybersecurity implications of digital transformation. Technical cybersecurity firms are too narrowly focused to provide strategic business guidance. There's a massive opportunity for a firm that can bridge that gap at the executive level. I studied the presentation, my mind racing through the implications of what Sarah was proposing. The expansion plan would require significant investment in new talent, marketing, and infrastructure, but it would also position TechFlow as a national leader in strategic cybersecurity consulting. This is ambitious, I said, looking up from the tablet. Are you talking about venture capital investment? I'm talking about a partnership, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. My firm specializes in growth stage investments in B2B services companies. We've been looking for the right cybersecurity consulting firm to support with both capital and strategic guidance. After yesterday's meeting, I think TechFlow might be exactly what we've been searching for. She outlined a proposed investment structure that would provide the capital needed for rapid expansion while maintaining my control over the company's strategic direction. The terms were generous, but more importantly, they came with access to Sarah's network of corporate contacts and strategic advisors. There's one more thing, Sarah said, closing the tablet and looking directly at me. I've been having conversations with the executive team at Meridian Financial Services. They're planning a major digital transformation initiative, and they're looking for a strategic consulting firm that can handle both the cybersecurity and organizational change management aspects of the project. Meridian Financial Services was one of the largest regional financial institutions in the Southwest, with operations across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. A digital transformation project of that scope would be worth tens of millions of dollars and would establish TechFlow as a major player in the strategic consulting market. They're specifically interested in firms that can provide integrated strategic guidance rather than traditional subcontractor relationships, Sarah continued. When I mentioned TechFlow's approach, they wanted to know if you'd be interested in presenting a comprehensive proposal for the entire project. I felt my heart rate increase as I processed the implications. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward, a chance to demonstrate that strategic cybersecurity consulting could compete directly with traditional firms like Thompson and Associates. What's the timeline? I asked, already thinking through the resources and planning required for a proposal of that magnitude. They want to see initial presentations next month, Sarah said, with final proposals due 6 weeks after that. It's an aggressive schedule, but it's also an opportunity to establish TechFlow as the primary strategic partner rather than getting caught up in competitive bidding processes. I spent the rest of lunch discussing the details of both the investment proposal and the Meridian opportunity. Sarah's strategic guidance was invaluable, helping me understand how to position TechFlow's capabilities for maximum impact with enterprise clients. By the time we finished eating, I felt like I had a clear roadmap for transforming my consulting practice into something much more significant. The drive back to my office gave me time to process everything Sarah had proposed. The investment opportunity would accelerate TechFlow's growth by months or even years, but more importantly, it would provide the credibility and resources needed to compete directly with established firms like Thompson and Associates. But there was something else about the opportunity that felt particularly satisfying. If TechFlow could successfully win the Meridian contract, it would demonstrate conclusively that strategic cybersecurity consulting was not just viable, but actually superior to traditional approaches for digital transformation projects. It would validate everything I'd been arguing about the integrated approach to business strategy and technical implementation. The next few weeks passed in a blur of intensive preparation and strategic planning. I assembled a team of my best consultants and began developing the comprehensive proposal that would either establish TechFlow as a major strategic consulting firm or prove that I'd overestimated the market opportunity. Marcus became my unofficial sounding board throughout the process, helping me refine the presentation and providing insights about how enterprise clients evaluated strategic consulting proposals. His experience working with Fortune 500 companies was invaluable as I developed the business case for TechFlow's integrated approach. "You realize what you're doing here, right?" he said. One evening, as we reviewed the latest version of the proposal. "You're not just pitching for a consulting contract. You're trying to redefine what strategic consulting means for digital transformation projects." "That's exactly what I'm doing," I replied, feeling a sense of clarity about my professional mission that had been building since the confrontation with David. Traditional consulting firms are still operating with assumptions about business strategy that don't apply to digital transformation challenges. Someone needs to demonstrate a better approach. The presentation to Meridian Financial Services was scheduled for a Thursday morning in their Dallas headquarters. I drove up the night before, staying at a hotel near their offices, and spending the evening doing final preparations and mental rehearsals. The Meridian executive team was impressive, consisting of their Chief Executive Officer, Chief Technology Officer, Chief Financial Officer, and Chief Operating Officer. They'd assembled in a conference room that rivaled Austin Metropolitan's facilities, with the kind of technological infrastructure that suggested they took digital transformation seriously. "Ms. Martinez," the CEO said as I set up my presentation materials, "we've been following TechFlow's work with interest. Sarah Kim speaks very highly of your strategic approach to cybersecurity consulting." I thanked him and launched into the presentation I'd been refining for weeks. The proposal was comprehensive, covering everything from strategic cybersecurity planning to organizational change management, with detailed timelines and deliverables for each phase of the digital transformation project. But the real focus of the presentation was on the integrated approach that would treat cybersecurity as a strategic business function, rather than a technical compliance requirement. I walked through case studies showing how this approach had delivered superior results for other companies, and I outlined the specific benefits that Meridian could expect from working with a consulting firm that understood both technology and business strategy. The questions that followed were sharp and detailed, covering everything from implementation timelines to resource requirements to competitive positioning. The Meridian executives were clearly experienced in evaluating strategic consulting proposals, and they pushed me to demonstrate that TechFlow could deliver on the ambitious promises I was making. "Ms. Martinez," the CFO said during one particularly challenging exchange, "your proposal is impressive, but we need to understand how TechFlow's approach differs from what we'd get from more established strategic consulting firms. What makes you confident that a cybersecurity-focused firm can handle the broader organizational transformation aspects of this project?" It was exactly the question I'd been preparing for, and I felt a surge of confidence as I launched into my response. "Sir, I think that question reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern digital transformation actually requires. The organizational changes that companies need to make aren't separate from cybersecurity considerations. They're driven by cybersecurity requirements." I pulled up a slide showing the interconnections between security architecture, operational processes, and business strategy. When you're transforming your customer experience systems, your security architecture decisions determine how customers can interact with your services. When you're redesigning your operational processes, your security protocols determine how efficiently those processes can function. When you're developing your competitive strategy, your security capabilities determine what kinds of services you can offer and how quickly you can adapt to market changes. The room fell silent as the executives processed the implications of what I was saying. I could see them beginning to understand that the traditional separation between strategic consulting and technical implementation might be not just artificial but counterproductive. Traditional consulting firms treat cybersecurity as a constraint that needs to be managed, I continued. We treat it as a strategic capability that can drive competitive advantage. That's not just a philosophical difference, it's a practical difference that affects every aspect of how we approach digital transformation projects. The presentation continued for another hour, with the Meridian executives asking increasingly detailed questions about implementation strategies and expected outcomes. By the time I finished, I felt like I'd successfully communicated both the strategic value of TechFlow's approach and our capability to deliver on complex enterprise projects. The CEO closed the meeting with a comment that made my heart race. "Ms. Martinez, this has been one of the most compelling strategic consulting presentations we've seen. We'll be making our decision within the next 2 weeks. But I want you to know that TechFlow is definitely under serious consideration. The drive back to Austin gave me time to decompress and reflect on everything that had happened. The presentation had gone better than I dared to hope, and I felt like I'd successfully articulated the strategic value of integrated cybersecurity consulting in a way that resonated with senior executives. But there was something else about the experience that felt significant. Standing in that conference room, presenting to C-suite executives about strategic business transformation, I'd felt completely confident in my expertise and my ability to deliver results. David's dismissive comments about entry-level technical work seemed not just wrong but almost absurdly out of touch with the reality of modern business challenges. The call from Meridian came 10 days later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other day but ended with everything changed. Their CEO personally delivered the news that TechFlow had been selected as the primary strategic consulting partner for their digital transformation project. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that suggested genuine respect, "we were impressed not just by your technical expertise, but by your strategic thinking and business acumen. We're looking forward to working with a consulting firm that truly understands the integrated nature of digital transformation challenges." The contract was worth $42 million over 3 years, making it the largest engagement in TechFlow's history and establishing the company as a major player in the strategic consulting market. But more importantly, it validated everything I'd been arguing about the strategic value of cybersecurity consulting. The news spread quickly through Austin's business community, and my phone began ringing with congratulations from colleagues and potential clients. But the call that meant the most came from my father, who'd somehow heard about the Meridian contract through his network of small business contacts. "Meja," he said, his voice thick with pride, "I don't understand all the technical details of what you do, but I know you just accomplished something incredible. Your mother and I are so proud of you." I felt tears prick my eyes as I thanked him. My parents had never fully understood my career path, but they'd always supported my ambitions and believed in my potential. Having them recognize this achievement felt like a validation of everything I'd worked toward. But the real impact of the Meridian contract became clear over the following weeks, as other major companies began reaching out to TechFlow for strategic consulting services. The success had created a momentum that was attracting exactly the kinds of enterprise clients I'd been hoping to work with. Sarah Kim's investment proposal became even more attractive in light of the new business opportunities, and we finalized the partnership agreement within a month. The capital injection allowed me to expand the team rapidly, bringing in senior consultants who could help deliver on the growing portfolio of strategic consulting engagements. But the most satisfying development came 6 weeks after the Meridian announcement, when Marcus called with news that would complete the transformation I'd been working towards since that confrontation with David. "Jessica, you're not going to believe this," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "I just heard that Thompson and Associates lost the Austin Metropolitan contract. Apparently, Austin Metropolitan decided to go with a different approach to their digital transformation project." The news hit me like a physical shock. Austin Metropolitan had been the project that was supposed to demonstrate David's expertise in strategic consulting, and now they'd decided to pursue a different path entirely. "Do you know what happened?" I asked, genuinely curious about how the situation had unfolded. "From what I heard, Austin Metropolitan's board became concerned about the cybersecurity implications of the digital transformation project," Marcus said. "They decided they needed a consulting firm that could provide integrated strategic guidance rather than coordinating between multiple contractors." I felt a surge of vindication mixed with something approaching sympathy for David. He'd been so confident in his approach to strategic consulting, so certain that his traditional business expertise was superior to my integrated technical and strategic thinking. Now he was learning that the business world was changing in ways that made his assumptions obsolete. But the call that would change everything came 2 days later, from a number I didn't recognize with a Dallas area code. The voice on the other end belonged to Patricia Williams, the senior consultant from Thompson and Associates who'd challenged me during the Austin Metropolitan meeting. "Jessica," she said, her tone carefully professional, "I hope you remember me from the Austin Metropolitan project. I'm calling because I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with you." I felt my pulse quicken as I recognized the implications of what she was saying. Patricia Williams was calling me about an opportunity, which meant that something significant had happened at Thompson and Associates. Of course I remember you, Patricia, I said, keeping my voice neutral despite my curiosity. What kind of opportunity are you referring to? I've recently been promoted to managing director of Thompson and Associates' new digital transformation practice, she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful confidence that suggested she was about to propose something significant. We're looking to hire a vice president of strategic cybersecurity to lead our cybersecurity consulting services, and your name came up as the ideal candidate. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Thompson and Associates, the firm that had dismissed my strategic expertise as entry-level technical work, was now trying to hire me to lead their cybersecurity consulting practice. David's confident assumptions about the hierarchy of business expertise had been so thoroughly disproven that his own firm was now trying to recruit the person he'd dismissed. That's an interesting opportunity, I said carefully, trying to process the implications of what Patricia was proposing. Can you tell me more about how Thompson and Associates is positioning this new practice? Patricia launched into a detailed explanation of how the firm had recognized the strategic importance of cybersecurity consulting and was looking to build a world-class practice that could compete with specialized firms like TechFlow. The position she was describing would involve leading a team of senior consultants, developing strategic cybersecurity services for Fortune 500 clients, and representing the firm in high-level business development activities. The compensation package is extremely competitive, Patricia continued, and the position would report directly to me as managing director. You'd have significant autonomy to develop the practice according to your strategic vision, with full support from Thompson and Associates resources and client relationships. I listened to the entire pitch, recognizing that Patricia was offering me everything I'd been working to build at TechFlow, but with the resources and credibility of an established consulting firm. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that would have been a dream come true 6 months earlier. Patricia, I said when she finished, I appreciate the offer, and I'm flattered that Thompson and Associates recognizes the value of strategic cybersecurity consulting. But I have to ask, where does David Thompson fit into this new practice structure? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear Patricia choosing her words carefully. David has been reassigned to focus on our traditional organizational development services. The new digital transformation practice operates as a separate division with its own leadership structure and client relationships. The implications were clear. David had been effectively demoted, moved away from the high-profile digital transformation projects that had been his specialty, and relegated to traditional consulting services that were becoming less relevant in the modern business environment. I see, I said, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and something approaching sympathy. And what makes you think I'd be interested in leaving TechFlow to join Thompson and Associates? Patricia's response was immediate and well-rehearsed. Jessica, you've built something impressive with TechFlow, but there are limits to what you can accomplish as an independent consultant. Thompson and Associates can provide the resources, credibility, and client relationships that would allow you to scale your strategic cybersecurity approach to a national level. It was a compelling argument, and I could see how the partnership would accelerate TechFlow's growth and expand my influence in the strategic consulting market. But there was something about the offer that felt fundamentally wrong, as if accepting it would be a betrayal of everything I'd been working toward. Patricia, I said, my voice carrying a note of finality, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in joining Thompson and Associates. TechFlow Solutions is exactly where I want to be, and I'm confident that we can compete successfully with any established consulting firm. The silence that followed was telling. Patricia had clearly expected me to be interested in the opportunity, and my rejection had caught her off guard. Jessica, I hope you'll reconsider, she said finally. This is a significant opportunity to shape the future of strategic cybersecurity consulting at a national level. I appreciate that, I replied, but I'm already shaping the future of strategic cybersecurity consulting. The difference is that I'm doing it on my own terms, with my own firm, and with clients who understand the strategic value of what we provide. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of completion that had been building since the Austin Metropolitan meeting. David Thompson had dismissed my work as entry-level technical services, confident that his traditional business expertise was superior to my integrated approach. Now his own firm was trying to hire me to lead the practice he'd insisted wasn't strategically important. But the real satisfaction came from recognizing that I'd built something more valuable than just a successful consulting practice. I demonstrated that the future of strategic consulting required a different kind of expertise than what had been successful in the past, and I'd positioned TechFlow to lead that transformation. The phone rang again within minutes, this time with a call from Robert Martinez at Austin Metropolitan. "Jessica," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone delivering good news, "I wanted to let you know that we've decided to move forward with TechFlow as our primary strategic consulting partner for the digital transformation project." The contract was worth $28 million over 2 years, making it the second largest engagement in TechFlow's history and establishing the company as the preferred strategic consulting partner for major financial institutions across the Southwest. But more importantly, it represented a complete vindication of everything I'd argued about the strategic value of cybersecurity consulting. Austin Metropolitan had specifically chosen TechFlow over traditional consulting firms because they recognized that digital transformation required integrated strategic thinking rather than coordinated technical implementation. As I sat in my office that evening, looking out over the Austin skyline and thinking about everything that had happened since that barbecue confrontation with David, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I'd transformed a technical consulting practice into a strategic consulting firm that could compete directly with established players like Thompson and Associates. I'd demonstrated that cybersecurity expertise could be genuinely strategic rather than simply technical. And I'd done it all on my own terms, without compromising my professional principles or accepting limitations that others had tried to impose. The game had changed, and I'd won by changing the rules entirely. 3 months after the Austin Metropolitan and Meridian contracts were finalized, I found myself standing in the elevator of a gleaming downtown Dallas office building, adjusting my blazer and mentally preparing for a meeting that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The elevator display showed floor numbers climbing toward the executive level of Meridian Financial Services, where I was scheduled to present quarterly results to their board of directors as their primary strategic consulting partner. The transformation of TechFlow Solutions had been rapid and comprehensive. Sarah Kim's investment had allowed us to expand from a 12-person boutique firm to a 50-person strategic consulting practice with offices in Austin, Dallas, and Houston. We'd recruited senior consultants from major firms across the country, many of whom had been frustrated by the traditional separation between technical expertise and strategic consulting that dominated their previous roles. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that spoke of serious corporate power, with marble floors, contemporary art, and the kind of understated elegance that suggested substantial financial resources. The receptionist, a professional woman in her 40s, greeted me with the kind of warm recognition that came from frequent interactions over the past months. "Ms. Martinez, they're ready for you in the boardroom," she said, leading me down a hallway lined with portraits of Meridian's previous chairmen and CEOs. "Mr. Harrison mentioned that the board is particularly interested in hearing about the cybersecurity metrics you've been tracking." The boardroom was everything you'd expect from a major financial institution, with a massive mahogany table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Dallas skyline. The Meridian board members were already seated, a mix of seasoned executives and industry leaders who collectively represented decades of financial services experience. "Jessica," said Chairman Harrison, rising to greet me with the kind of respectful warmth that had developed over our months of working together, "we've been looking forward to this presentation. The preliminary results from the digital transformation project have been impressive, but we're eager to hear about the strategic implications." I set up my presentation materials and launched into the quarterly report I'd been preparing for weeks. The numbers were extraordinary: a 43% reduction in cybersecurity incidents, a 67% improvement in customer satisfaction scores for digital services, and a 31% increase in operational efficiency across all digital platforms. But more importantly, the integrated approach to cybersecurity and business strategy had positioned Meridian as a leader in financial services innovation. "These metrics are remarkable," said board member Patricia Coleman, studying the data with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine strategic thinking. "But I'm particularly interested in the competitive positioning analysis. How has the cybersecurity strategy affected Meridian's market position?" It was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated why the board had been willing to invest in strategic cybersecurity consulting. They understood that the real value wasn't just in preventing security incidents, but in using security capabilities to drive business growth and competitive advantage. The cybersecurity architecture we've implemented has enabled Meridian to offer services that your competitors simply can't match, I explained, pulling up slides that showed market analysis and competitive positioning data. Your customers can access their accounts from anywhere, at any time, with complete confidence in the security of their transactions. Your business clients can integrate their systems with yours in ways that would be impossible with traditional security approaches. I spent the next hour walking through specific examples of how the integrated cybersecurity strategy had created new revenue opportunities and strengthened customer relationships. The board members asked detailed questions about scalability, competitive response, and long-term strategic implications. Exactly the kinds of high-level business discussions that David had insisted were beyond the scope of technical consulting. Jessica, said CEO Michael Rodriguez as the presentation concluded, this has been one of the most compelling strategic consulting presentations we've seen. The results speak for themselves, but more importantly, you've demonstrated that cybersecurity can be a genuine competitive advantage, rather than just a compliance requirement. As I packed up my materials and prepared to leave, Chairman Harrison made a comment that crystallized everything I'd been working toward. 6 months ago, we were looking at this as a technology upgrade project. What you've helped us accomplish is a fundamental transformation of how we operate as a business. That's the difference between technical consulting and strategic consulting. The drive back to Austin gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since that confrontation with David at the barbecue. TechFlow had evolved from a boutique cybersecurity firm to a major strategic consulting practice, but more importantly, I demonstrated that the future of consulting required a different kind of expertise than what had been successful in the past. My phone rang just as I was entering Austin city limits, with a call from Ryan that carried the kind of excitement that suggested good news. "Jessica, you're gonna love this," he said, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. "I just got off the phone with Marcus, and he had some interesting news about Thompson and Associates." I felt my pulse quicken, recognizing that any news about David's firm would have significant implications for the broader consulting market. "What kind of news?" "Apparently, they've been struggling to compete for digital transformation projects since they lost the Austin Metropolitan contract," Ryan said. "Marcus heard from someone at Harbor Capital that Thompson and Associates has been losing major clients to firms that can provide integrated cybersecurity and business strategy services." The irony was almost too perfect. David had been so confident that traditional strategic consulting was superior to integrated technical expertise, but his firm was now struggling to compete because they couldn't provide the kind of comprehensive services that modern businesses required. "There's more," Ryan continued. "Marcus also heard that David himself has been having some professional difficulties. Apparently, several of his long-term clients have been questioning his understanding of digital transformation challenges." I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and something approaching sympathy. David had been genuinely talented at traditional strategic consulting, but his inability to adapt to the changing business environment had made his expertise less valuable than it had been in the past. The full implications of Thompson and Associates' struggles became clear over the following weeks, as I began hearing from colleagues and contacts throughout the Austin business community. The firm that had once dominated the local strategic consulting market was now scrambling to remain relevant in an economy where cybersecurity and digital transformation had become central to business strategy. But the most significant development came in the form of a phone call from Patricia Williams, the same senior consultant who had tried to recruit me to lead Thompson and Associates' new digital transformation practice. Her tone was markedly different from our previous conversation, carrying the kind of careful professionalism that suggested she was delivering difficult news. "Jessica," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I wanted to let you know that Thompson and Associates has made some significant organizational changes. We've decided to focus exclusively on traditional organizational development services, and we're discontinuing our digital transformation practice." The announcement was stunning in its implications. Thompson and Associates, the firm that had dismissed my strategic expertise as entry-level technical work, was now admitting that they couldn't compete in the digital transformation market that had become central to modern business strategy. "I see," I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the vindication I felt. "What does that mean for the consulting staff who were working on digital transformation projects?" Patricia's pause was telling. "Several of our senior consultants have decided to explore opportunities with firms that specialize in integrated strategic consulting. David Thompson has been reassigned to focus on our traditional client relationships, but his role has been significantly reduced." The news that David had been effectively demoted was both satisfying and sobering. He'd been so confident in his understanding of strategic consulting, so certain that his traditional business expertise would always be valuable. Now he was learning that the business world had changed in ways that made his assumptions obsolete. But the conversation that would complete my transformation came 2 weeks later, in the form of a family dinner that I'd been dreading since the barbecue confrontation. Becca had called to invite me to a celebration dinner for her promotion to senior marketing manager at Chen Group, and I couldn't find a polite way to decline. The restaurant was one of Austin's upscale establishments, the kind of place where successful professionals gathered to celebrate career milestones and business achievements. I arrived fashionably late, partly from professional habit and partly because I wanted to minimize the time I'd spend in potentially awkward conversation with David. But when I entered the private dining room, I was surprised to find David looking subdued and uncomfortable, a marked contrast to the confident, dismissive persona he'd displayed during our previous encounters. He was seated at the far end of the table, picking at his appetizer and participating only minimally in the conversation. "Jess!" Becca exclaimed, rising to greet me with the kind of enthusiastic warmth that suggested she was hoping to smooth over any lingering tensions. "I'm so glad you could make it. We have so much to celebrate tonight." I congratulated her on the promotion and took my seat across from my parents, who were beaming with pride at their daughter's success. The conversation flowed easily through dinner, covering family news, career updates, and plans for the holidays. But I could feel David's eyes on me throughout the meal, and I sensed that he was working up the courage to address the elephant in the room. The opportunity came during dessert, when Becca excused herself to take a work call and my parents were deep in conversation with David's colleagues. David leaned forward, his voice carrying the kind of careful humility that suggested he'd been thinking about this conversation for weeks. "Jessica," he said, his tone markedly different from the confident dismissal he'd displayed at the barbecue, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about your work, and I was wrong about the strategic value of cybersecurity consulting." I looked at him carefully, recognizing that this was a moment of genuine professional and personal reckoning. "I appreciate that, David. What made you change your perspective?" He took a long sip of his wine before responding, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd been forced to confront the limitations of his own understanding. "Watching what you've accomplished with TechFlow over the past few months has been humbling. You've built something that I didn't think was possible, and you've done it by understanding business challenges that I completely missed." The admission was more generous than I'd expected, and I felt some of the anger I'd been carrying since the barbecue begin to dissolve. "David, I think we were both operating with different assumptions about how business strategy works in the modern economy. You weren't wrong about the importance of strategic thinking. You were just wrong about what kinds of expertise qualify as strategic." He nodded thoughtfully. "I've been forced to learn that lesson the hard way. Thompson & Associates has been struggling to compete because we couldn't provide the kind of integrated services that companies actually need. We were still thinking in terms of organizational hierarchies that don't exist anymore." I felt a surge of empathy for David, recognizing that his professional struggles were the result of industry changes that had made his expertise less valuable rather than any personal failing. "What are you planning to do now?" "I'm exploring opportunities with firms that specialize in the kind of integrated consulting that you've pioneered," he said, his voice carrying the kind of careful hopefulness that suggested he was still processing the implications of his career transition. "I've realized that I need to develop a better understanding of how technology and business strategy intersect." The conversation continued for another hour, with David asking detailed questions about TechFlow's approach to strategic consulting and my thoughts on the future of the industry. By the end of the evening, I felt like we'd reached a genuine understanding about the professional challenges we'd both faced and the different paths we'd chosen to address them. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred since that initial confrontation at the barbecue. David had gone from dismissing my work as entry-level technical services to recognizing that I'd built something strategically valuable that he couldn't replicate. Thompson and Associates had gone from dominating the local strategic consulting market to struggling to remain competitive in an industry they no longer understood. But more importantly, I'd demonstrated that the future of strategic consulting required a different kind of expertise than what had been successful in the past. The traditional separation between technical implementation and strategic planning had become not just artificial but actively counterproductive for companies trying to succeed in a digital economy. The phone call that would complete my vindication came the following Monday, from Chairman Harrison at Meridian Financial Services. "Jessica," he said, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that suggested significant news, "I wanted to let you know that the board has approved a major expansion of our strategic consulting partnership with TechFlow." He outlined a comprehensive 3-year agreement that would position TechFlow as Meridian's primary strategic consulting partner for all digital transformation and cybersecurity initiatives. The contract was worth over $100 million and would establish TechFlow as one of the largest strategic consulting firms in the Southwest. More importantly, Chairman Harrison continued, "We're recommending TechFlow to other major financial institutions across the country. We believe that your integrated approach to cybersecurity and business strategy represents the future of strategic consulting, and we want to help you scale that approach nationally." As I hung up the phone, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond financial success or professional recognition. I'd transformed a technical consulting practice into a strategic consulting firm that could compete directly with established players like Thompson and Associates. I demonstrated that cybersecurity expertise could be genuinely strategic rather than simply technical. And I'd done it all on my own terms, without compromising my professional principles or accepting limitations that others had tried to impose. The success of TechFlow had created opportunities that I'd never imagined when I started the company. We were now regularly invited to speak at industry conferences, consult with government agencies on cybersecurity policy, and advise Fortune 500 companies on digital transformation strategy. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that went far beyond the financial returns. But the most satisfying aspect of the transformation was the recognition that I'd helped create a new model for strategic consulting that better served the needs of modern businesses. The traditional separation between technical expertise and strategic thinking had been replaced by an integrated approach that treated technology as a fundamental component of business strategy rather than a separate implementation detail. 6 months later, I found myself standing in the conference room of a major Fortune 500 company, presenting to their board of directors about how cybersecurity strategy could drive competitive advantage and business growth. The presentation was similar to dozens I'd given over the past year, but this particular engagement carried special significance because it represented the complete transformation of how I was perceived in the business community. The board members listened intently as I outlined TechFlow's approach to strategic cybersecurity consulting, asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, competitive positioning, and long-term strategic implications. These were exactly the kinds of high-level business discussions that David had insisted were beyond the scope of technical consulting, and now they were the foundation of my professional practice. "Ms. Martinez," said the company's CEO as the presentation concluded, "this has been one of the most compelling strategic consulting presentations we've seen. You've demonstrated that cybersecurity can be a genuine competitive advantage rather than just a compliance requirement." As I packed up my materials and prepared to leave, I reflected on the complete transformation that had occurred since that barbecue confrontation with David. I'd gone from being dismissed as a provider of entry-level technical services to being recognized as a strategic consulting expert who could compete with any established firm in the industry. The success of TechFlow had validated everything I'd believed about the strategic value of cybersecurity consulting and the importance of integrated technical and business expertise. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that the future of consulting required a different kind of knowledge than what had been successful in the past. Walking out of that corporate headquarters, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. I'd proven that technical expertise could be strategically valuable, that cybersecurity consulting could compete with traditional business consulting, and that the future belonged to people who understood how to integrate technology and business strategy in ways that created genuine competitive advantage. The phone in my pocket buzzed with another potential client inquiry, another opportunity to demonstrate that the rules of strategic consulting had changed permanently. I smiled as I read the message, knowing that I'd helped create those new rules and that I was perfectly positioned to succeed in the business environment they'd created. The game had changed, and I'd won by changing the rules entirely. David Thompson had learned that dismissing someone's expertise as entry-level could be the biggest strategic mistake of his career. And I'd learned that sometimes the best response to being underestimated is to build something so successful that the people who dismissed you are forced to acknowledge their own limitations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.